Back in 2010, and you'll have to bear with me here, Justin Bieber released a memoir. For those keeping score at home, it was called Justin Bieber, First Step to Forever with the number 2, another : My Story. I think you'll agree that is an objectively awesome title. He was 16 at the time, and there's no question he'd achieved a lot in those 16 years, or that his fans were desperate to hear what was going on in his inner life. But 16 seemed young for a memoir. It's a topic on which people have strongly formed, I was going to say views, but prejudices is closer to the truth. People don't think young people should write memoirs. Almost a decade ago, former Read This guest Leslie Jamieson debated with Benjamin Moser about how young is too young to write an autobiography in this piece for the New York Times. They were debating a review from a memoirist in their 30s, so the standard seems to be pretty variable. All of this came to mind late last year when Australian journalist and writer, the very talented Lech Blaine, released his book, Australian Gospel, A Family Saga. It was one of the hits of the summer, on endless recommendation lists, and one of those books that seemed near ubiquitous on beach towels everywhere I went. Now, before we go on, let me be very clear. I'm not saying Lech Blaine is Justin Bieber. That's important to note. But here's the thing. He turns 33 this year, and Australian Gospel is, in a sense, his second memoir. His first, his debut book, Car Crash, told the gripping story of his life in the aftermath of a horrendous road accident that killed several of his friends. It was powerful and compelling, beautifully written, and launched this talented writer into the world of publishing. He followed it with political essays and thoughtful journalism for the monthly, for the quarterly essay, and beyond. There is no question the guy is a crazy talent. But 2 memoirs by 33? What are the odds that such a relatively young life could hold enough material for a second book? As it turns out, pretty good. Lech wasn't done with his own story. In his childhood, for his parents and his siblings, there was this wild, outrageous, at times tragic story that was waiting to be told. I'm Michael Williams, and this is Read This, a show about the books we love and the unlikely true stories behind them. I spoke to Lech at last year's Canberra Writers Festival. Like so many family sagas, Australian Gospel is filled with a slew of unforgettable characters, each with complicated backstories. So let's pick up the conversation with Lech introducing us to some of the key players.
So Michael and Mary Shelley were these incredibly beautiful socialites in Sydney. Michael was from the North Shore and he was blonde-haired and blue-eyed, and he went to Knox Grammar, and his first love was the actress Jackie Weaver, and he was seemed like he was on a fast track to incredible success and wealth in his 20s, and then suffered a nervous breakdown around the age of 28. And he, after an incredible amount of both drug use and sex outside of marriage, because he was incredibly promiscuous, he went to a psychiatric hospital in near Botany Bay and met a woman named Carrie, who would eventually change her name to Mary Shelley. And she was also from incredible privilege. She was born in London, taken to Sydney when she was 11, grew up in the eastern suburbs. Her father was an incredibly successful restaurateur in King's Cross, and she subsequently suffered a nervous breakdown as well. And so this is how Michael and Mary, as she would eventually be known, met in a psychiatric hospital, and they fell in love with each other. And in the process of falling in love and then moving in with each other, they started reading the Bible, and essentially Michael began to believe that he was the Archangel Michael in the Bible. And so they decided essentially to pack everything up, get rid of all their things, and hitchhike to North Queensland and spread the gospel of Jesus. And they had a son named Elijah in 1980. And then, to cut a long story short, because that's already dragging on a little bit, and that's the tip of the iceberg, they had 3 more children after Elijah. Saul, Joshua, who would eventually be placed with my parents, and their names were changed to Stephen and John. And then they later had my sister Hannah in the bathtub of a 3-star motel in New Zealand, where they were on the run from social workers and police. And Hannah was extradited at the age of 1 to pub in country Queensland, which my parents were running, and had all these foster kids. And Mum fell pregnant with me about 48 hours after Hannah's arrival, and I was born in 1992. So that's where it all kind of linked up, and that's why I'm here and how I'm able to be a part of this story and be able to tell it.
Lech, I want to start in 2017 when you went on conversations with Richard Feidler and you told a story that ultimately forms the basis of Australian gospel. Before that interview, how often had you told different versions of that story?
Funnily enough, very little. A lot of my closest friends had no idea about the scope of the story. So a lot of people who knew me well were hearing it for the first time, because growing up in a family where all of my siblings were foster children, except for me, so I was born last, it wasn't something that I broadcasted publicly much growing up. And that was not so much because I was ashamed of it, but just because of how normal my upbringing seemed, in the sense that my siblings had always been there. So I wasn't kind of going to school and talking about my foster siblings. I was always talking about my siblings. And then I think when the crux of the story in terms of the stalking of my family was happening, when I was 10, then it was kind of like a privacy issue. Like, I actually couldn't really talk about it in a way that might expose myself, partly rationally, but partly just out of fear. And there probably was a bit of shame about the fact, my family was being stalked by notorious Christian fanatics, and so that's not really water cooler talk at primary school or at high school. So, and then after high school, I think it was something that I grappled with privately, and even with my siblings, who were the biological children of these people. We weren't sitting around talking about the crazy thing that had happened. My mum was different. She was someone who probably lent on me in that respect, because I wasn't the person directly exposed to the threat of these people. And so I think I became an important person for her to be able to talk to about it. And that's definitely drove my desire to tell the story, because in 2017, she was terminally ill, so she only had about a year left to live, and I wanted her to be able to hear. I knew that the book was going to take a lot longer, but I wanted her to be able to hear the basis of that story told publicly before she died.
I want to come back to your mum in a bit, just because she is the kind of crux, I think, of this book in many ways. But there's a decision very early on in the book that I want to ask you about, which is that you have a family tree that has on one side the Shelleys and on the other side your parents. What it doesn't have is you anywhere in it. You've made a decision to open a book about your family and about the many complicating factors in your family history, and you've deliberately decided to excise yourself from the family tree. Why?
I guess everyone wants to do that occasionally, don't they?
Oh yeah, I'm not in my family tree, I promise you.
So that was something that I did think about a bit, and I made the decision to leave myself out because I had other foster siblings who were part of the family, and I thought it would be too complicated to include their biological parents, and then it would have been like a mess, and I didn't know how to quite work that out. And I thought that the main thing that you needed to know from that family tree was the birth names of my siblings and their brother Elijah and what they were eventually known as. So just as a simple way throughout the story, because it can get quite confusing when you've got Michael and Mary who refer to their children as their birth names, and then my siblings Stephen, John and Hannah who are referred to by their names when they were placed with the Blaines. And so I just, that was the main reason. It wasn't kind of to sum everything up, but I thought that I didn't want to leave my sister Rebecca out of that family tree, so I thought I'll leave myself out as well.
There is, though, you're assiduous in it, and it's there in the two different sets of names. But in the writing of the story, you take great care in a way that I find deeply moving to allow for different people's rationalization, justification, understanding of the story. You have on the one hand the Shelleys who, through a series of their own choices, through incapacity, lose access to their own children they've conceived. And then you have your parents who are raising those children with love and care and support. How hard was it to give both those stories equal care in the writing of the book?
Well, it's interesting because when I first started thinking about it and researching it as a book, which was 2013, so 11 years ago, I was thinking about the book as basically the story of the Shelleys, with my family popping up. And so I sort of thought that Michael and Mary and all of their craziness was the crux of the story. And probably Michael, really, because he's a source of so much of the book. And it was only through writing it, and this is a process over, a decade, where my parents were coming more and more to the forefront. And I was also thought of my father as kind of being the direct foil for Michael. And so that was a tango that I saw as at the heart of the book. And the mothers gradually emerged as, I think, the emotional heart of the book. And I tried to respect the trauma that Mary had suffered both in her previous life, but also the trauma of losing her children. And I think that my mother, who had always said that she wanted to write a book about it, but I don't think she ever, similarly to me, I don't think she ever thought of herself as the main character of the book, but eventually she kind of became, I think, the main character in the book.
It's funny, that idea of main character. Like, Michael is clearly someone who moved through the world believing himself to be the main character of not just every story you could think of, but some that you couldn't think of. Like, he was definitely centering himself. But part of what comes through so beautifully in the book is the contrast between the two couples and your parents as a kind of counterpoint, not just a counterpoint to Michael and Mary, but actually the embodiment of everything that Michael held in disdain about Australia, about Australian culture, about modern life. Can you describe your folks for us?
Yeah, that's a pretty good summary. So Michael, his Christianity was a very weird thing, because in all of his copious amounts of writing, and I'm talking like millions of words, like he was writing reports, and he was incredibly intelligent. He had a chemical engineering degree and an MBA, and he started a PhD, which he never finished because he had a disagreement with the head of the school, predictably. And so he didn't refer that much to theological stuff, like, except for the basic fact that he was God's right-hand man. A lot of his writing was about his hatred of Australian culture, his hatred of sport, his hatred of alcohol, his hatred of gambling, and a very, very fastidious obsession with weight, because he was very slim and became even slimmer once he became a Christian and started fasting all the time. And so this was, and then once his children were taken for being underweight, he was obsessed with weight. And then my parents, Dad was a 130 kilogram publican in country Queensland who loved sport, loved gambling, and loved alcohol. So out of all the crazy things in the book, like, that has got to be one of the craziest.
It is like he's manifested. Like, he's like Michael's worst nightmare come to life is your dad.
But then in another way, Dad was kind of perfect, because he was probably one of the only people who would be completely unafraid of a Christian preacher potentially turning up. He says to a bouncer he hires at the pub, keep an eye out for undesirables, and the bouncer's trying to get to the bottom of it, and he says, no, in particular, you're looking for a Christian as skinny as 6:30, is it? Skinnier than a minute to 6.
Skinnier than a minute to 6. I'm like, that is just beautiful. I mean, that portrait of your dad that comes through, I love, but the ways in which your parents are kind of demonstrated as a kind of formidable team. Your dad, Tom, is immediately loving, but also just wants to get on with things. Whereas your mum's level of care, as evidenced by the kind of notes she takes and the writing she puts together when thinking about what it is to foster damaged kids is incredibly moving. Tell us a bit about your mum.
Yeah, so they were similar in the sense that they'd both had quite traumatic upbringings, and that's something that that's why I retraced in the book the competing narratives of those four characters, because Dad might have seemed in his later incarnation as being fairly one-dimensional, and then I think when you see what happened when he was growing up, he lost both his parents and had a horrific meatworks accident when he was 16 and had left school at 13. I think that you started to see that as being a coping mechanism for what had been a pretty hard life, and so he used humour as a way to cope with that. And I think Mum also had a very poor traumatic upbringing. She was kicked out of home at 16. There was always lots of alcohol in the house, and Mum had a number of nervous breakdowns. But she was blessed with this incredible intellect, which wasn't really nourished in any formal way. She also left school at the end of grade 10, but she was just a voracious reader. Even when she was raising 6 or 7 kids, she would read 6 books a week. And so she had an incredible brain, which had never been able to be kind of encouraged during her upbringing, but she deployed all of that intellect to foster caring. And so she saw it not as just an emotional crutch because she'd had 4 miscarriages, but she saw it as like a vocation. And she did all the reading necessary across, the legal realm, the psychological realm, the literary realm, because she believed in stories and she believed in redemption for people from circumstances like hers. And that's what made her the perfect foster carer, because nobody in her view was ever beyond redemption. And so I think I was incredibly blessed to have that as a mother, but also as a source of material, because she, like Michael, had just kept fastidious notes about and diary entries about everything that happened. And so even before Michael and Mary were in the picture, and so I was kind of handed this incredible trove of information. And yeah, I guess my job was to not be overwhelmed by the amount of detail that I've been given by these people and through my interviews, and really hone in on who they were as people and just let the reader see them and hear their voices and just let them do their thing rather than me or my writing being the star of the story.
When we return, Lech shares how his perception of the Shelleys, and in particular Mary Shelley, has changed over the years, and why writing this book in 2024 made sense. We'll be right back. So, as you said before, in primary school growing up, the idea of having all these foster siblings was not unusual to you. That was just the nature of your family. But at the point at which the Shelleys lurched back into your lives and began stalking, harassing, became a very active presence, that does seem to me to be a fairly traumatic set of incidents for your family to kind of circle around from that age. Can you talk about the first time Mary came back on the scene?
Yeah, I remember that whole period vividly, because it was just, there's that saying that there's decades where nothing happens and days where decades happens, and that was kind of how it felt. I was actually cricket training, and I remember getting back with Dad, and there were just police cars everywhere, and we sort of thought that someone had died, or that my brother John, who had been in a bit of trouble with the law, had done something particularly crazy. And then it turned out that Mary Shelley had rocked up to the house, and so the Shelleys were allowed no direct contact with their children, and they had no idea where we lived, and we were kind of in witness protection in a way. And it was a earth-shattering moment. Like it wasn't. It's hard to explain how viscerally afraid we were, because I look back now as an adult and I've done so much research into the Shelleys and I see them in 3-dimensional ways. But when with Michael in town and with Mary in tow, this is not long after September 11, I literally saw Michael Shelley as being like a Osama bin Laden rocking up to your house in a white robe. Like, that's how much fear he invoked both in me and my family. And I was the youngest, and I was a particularly anxious kid, which is a trait that I inherited from my mother, whereas my sister Hannah, who they were threatening to kidnap, she was much more like Dad. And so she weathered that whole situation with a lot more stoicism than I did. But yeah, there was a very, very genuine fear that they would attempt to kidnap Hannah.
One of the things that struck me reading this book is the ways in which Michael's marriage to Mary and their relationship we would understand through a very different lens now, talking and thinking about it. I mean, it's a classic model of coercive control, a model of a kind of abusive relationship. How much was that something that was always clear to you, or how much of that was a product of writing the book, made you understand Mary's fragility and lack of agency in so much of the story?
Yeah, it wasn't clear to me growing up at all, and it wasn't clear to, I don't think, the rest of my family. I think my mum had incredible sympathy for Mary. That was something that she understood even before maybe the more modern understanding of what was happening to her. But that was one of the beautiful things about writing the book, was giving Mary a sense of humanity which I did not see as a child or even as a teenager. And the level of control that Michael exerted over her wasn't clear to a lot of the people, even outside the Blaines, who might have been connected to Michael and Mary from their previous lives. And so there were acquaintances and friends of Michael who thought that Mary had been the one that had brainwashed Michael into Christianity, which was just, when you actually retraced the timeline of events and the different versions of events, was just completely clear that Michael was someone who had not just brainwashed Mary with a shared belief about the fact that he was an archangel sent to earth by God, but at multiple times throughout their lives had derailed attempts by Mary to reach a compromise that would have enabled her to have a regular contact with her children, which is something that my parents definitely would have allowed, and is something that my mum directly offered. And then Michael would come back in, and when you retrace the letters and the timing of everything, you see just how poisonous of an effect he had on the lives of many people, but particularly on the life of his third wife, Mary.
If we can return for a second to your conversation with Richard Feidler in 2017, at that point you've been researching and thinking about it as a book, or thinking about it as a story you want to tell for some time. You have that conversation, and one of the things that happens is people come out of the woodwork in considerable numbers. They hear it, and they've all got stories of the Shelleys one way or the other.
That was remarkable, and that added to my understanding of who these people were before they were the Shelleys, or before they were these Christian fanatics. And that was an incredibly healing moment for a lot of the people that listened to it, because while they were on they'd staged kidnappings, they'd threatened to kill premiers, they'd rocked up to Parliament, they'd been kicked out, they'd stalked world leaders, they'd stalked priests. There wasn't kind of a publicly available narrative joining all of that up, especially because at the centre of the story was children in foster care, so it wasn't something that you could publicly identify. And so I think that people hearing that story and hearing an explanation for it, but also knowing that the children of the Shelleys, at least my three siblings, had happy and stable lives, I think that was something that provided a lot of relief.
It does point to, though, what must have been one of the challenges of putting this book together, putting it down on paper, bringing it out into the world, is the number of people who have a sense of ownership over this story, or adjacency to the story, or direct, that thing about your responsibility to others. Again, part of what is so moving about this book is the care you take in not claiming for yourself anything that you feel uneasy about doing that with, but also allowing space for the other ways in which people's lives have been touched by these stories. How hard is it with your siblings and their role in the story? How much ambivalence do they have about the telling of it?
I think when I first talked about researching the story, and I mean, at the time I kind of felt like I was 40 or 50, but I was in my early 20s, so I think that they were a bit puzzled why I would be remotely interested in kind of researching it, let alone contacting their biological father. But even then, they were always supportive of that and incredibly interested in the stuff that I found out. So throughout that process, I don't think that they were ever, they weren't calling me up every day to check where I was at, but they were incredibly supportive of my decision to write about it. And now that I've finished it, and now that they've read it, like, they couldn't be more over the moon, partly because Michael and Mary have both passed away, and so they're not living in fear of them anymore. And I've given them something which not only tells their story and provides details that they never had any knowledge of, which explains certain aspects of their personalities and life experience, but it also disabuses some of that fear in the same way that happened to me. And you lose some of that anger once you start actually empathising, especially with Mary. And also because my parents have both passed away, and I've got 13 nieces and nephews, and I've kind of created this story which, not in a historical way, it's not like a work of history, but it actually brings to life my parents in a way that my nieces and nephews, who will never get the chance to meet them, will be able to meet them on the page and actually be able to see them and hear them. And they will also get the genesis story of their parents in a way that you don't necessarily sit around a kitchen table and tell a story like this with this level of detail. But when you read it, you feel it in a way that you don't if you're just hearing it. So I think that for them, I think that's probably the best part about it all.
For you, though, I mean, an 11-year run-up to this book, and in the meantime, you've actually established a career for yourself as a published writer, and you found your voice and you found your craft. And I'm curious about how necessary those steps were to get you to the point where you could actually finish this book, or you could conceive of the shape of it or know how to approach it. How different a writer are you now to the one you were when you started on this?
I did do an essay based on it with the Griffith Review in 2017, but I remember when I first started writing it in that summer in 2013, I was writing the story like in the voice of Tolstoy, and it was like going to be War and Peace, and so it was incredibly overwrought, incredibly overwritten. The Shelleys were kind of monstrous figures. The fear and trepidation was like dripping from every page, whereas I think not just writing my first book, Car Crash, that was helpful, but I think writing political essays and interviewing people and just letting their voice shine through, which is, it kind of taught me not just about the structure of the story, but how light of a touch you need to give to provide a narrative that isn't dripping with fear and trepidation, that actually has the subtlety and the quietness. It isn't shouting at you. It isn't telling you what to think about anything. And so I think all those years of writing those different things and then publishing a book and then going through the editorial processes, and it got me to the point where if I had have written that book even 5 years ago, it would be a very different story.
Lech Blaine's incredible book, Australian Gospel, A Family Saga, is available at all good bookstores now. I'm pretty sure Justin Bieber's memoir might have been remaindered. Before we go, I wanted to let you know what I've been reading this week, and I've picked up the latest piece of Australian rural noir. It's a historical novel. It's set in 1974 in the Riverina, and it's called Gunnawah. It's by Ronni, a local writer, very talented. It's a pseudonym, so I don't know much about them, but the book is a really terrific read. Lots of fun and has a mystery at its heart. If you love rural noir, this is a good one. You can find Gunnawah and all the other books we've mentioned in this episode at your favourite independent bookstore. That's it for this week's show. If you enjoyed it, please tell your friends, rate and review us, all the usual things. Read this out there in the world. Next week, I'm sitting down with award-winning writer Michelle de Kretser to discuss her new book, Theory and Practice.
I would say that when I had finished the book, I really felt a sense of exhilaration. I felt I had made something different.
Read This is a Schwartz Media production, made possible by the generous support of the ARA Group. The show is produced and edited by Clara Ames, with mixing by Travis Evans and original compositions by Zoltan Fetcher. Thanks for listening. See you next week.